Hello, and welcome to the Trustwave webinar, A+ Cybersecurity, Trustwave's Actionable Education Vertical Threat Briefing. I'm Doug Olenek, Digital Content Marketing Manager at Trustwave and your moderator. Joining us today is Ziv Mador. He is Trustwave's Vice President of spiderLabs Security Research. Today, Ziv will break down the report, spiderLabs 2024 Education Threat Landscape, Trustwave Threat Intelligence Briefing and Mitigation Strategies, which was issued just today. The report highlights the significant trends currently affecting the industry and offers actionable intelligence and recommended mitigations for every step of the attack cycle. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you're viewing this session live, our webinar platform allows you to customize your viewer screen. Feel free to adjust the size and positioning of the slide windows. We do recommend that you use Chrome as the browser of choice. If you have any problems with the audio or session delivery, I recommend that you just hit refresh and the system should reset and overcome any connectivity problems. Now, after Ziv completes his presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. If you have any questions, please don't be shy and place them in the area provided on your screen at any time during the webinar. And if we can't get to the questions, we will answer them by email after the session is completed. And finally, today's presentation will be recorded, and we will be sending a follow-up email to all attendees with the link to that recording. And with all of that said, we'll dive right into it. Ziv, the show is yours.
Thank you very much, Doug, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar about the threats that impact the education industry. What we're going to offer here is actionable intelligence based on our research. How does cyber attacks impact universities, schools, and other education institutions around the world? Okay, so with that, let's kick things off. This quote from CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, nicely demonstrates the problem with many schools, and by saying schools, we refer here both to elementary schools, primary schools, and universities, that they are becoming a target, but their cybersecurity posture is insufficient, to say the least. And what we're going to show you throughout this presentation are examples how they're attacked and how those attacks can be mitigated. So here are some examples from the news. Let's start with the one on the top left. It's from the last couple of days. I actually edited it just before this presentation. Top UK universities are recovering from targeted DDoS attacks. And those attacks were carried out by a Russian threat group called Anonymous Sudan. In spite of the name, it's not African, it's actually Russian. And those DDoS attacks pretty seriously impacted the networks of a couple of universities there. But it's not limited to Europe or to the UK. We see ransomware attacks and other types of cyber attacks against universities in the States, in Australia, in many other geographies. So it's a global problem. And what we're going to talk is why that's happening and what we can do about it. There are a couple of challenges that are unique to the education industry, more than any other industry. Let's start with the BYOD dilemma, the bring your own device. More than any other business, universities must host thousands and thousands of laptops and cell phones from their students, staff members, other guests that they have almost zero control over. That means many of those laptops might be infected, connect to their networks, and that malware might spread into the university networks. What we're going to show is that it's even hard for the security teams in the universities to control their own system, let alone all those numerous laptops and devices that are brought to their networks and connect to them. Second thing is the complex infrastructure. There are many different faculties in the universities, many different institutions, buildings, departments, laboratories. All of them wants to connect to the internet one or another. Some they want to interact with third-party providers, service providers. we're talking about very complex infrastructure, which is hard to maintain. Add to that the fact that unlike corporate companies and definitely government departments, the policies in universities are much looser. There are less rules and are less enforced. For example, people usually can browse anywhere they want. There are no limitations in most universities, which increases the risks. Many universities and even schools hold a lot of data. There are data troves. If we talk about schools, they include data, they manage data about minors, right? Kids and young people, young teenagers who are minors, which adds to the risk. Just imagine that a malicious actor can get information about the schedule of the school and the students, the young kids that learn there and when they come back home, for example, at the end of the day, and their addresses. But beyond that, universities maintain tons of data about intellectual property, their patents, diagrams, other sensitive information, and of course, a lot of information about their students, credit card information, because at the end, these are businesses that charge for their services. So they hold a lot of data that can become a compelling target for the attackers. The education sector has more exposed systems by far than any other industry. I'm going to show you soon the statistics, but there are many publicly accessible devices and servers. Some of them are web servers or other servers that are used to connect to the networks, like SSH or SCP for file transfer. And those systems, if they are not properly maintained, can become backdoors into the university's networks. Resource scarcity. Despite of the fact that many those networks are huge, there are tens of thousands of people connecting to universities' networks. The IT security teams, they usually are very small, can be just a few people. So obviously, too few to effectively manage the security in those large networks and enforce policies and monitor those systems and respond to incidents. And last, legacy risks. Perhaps because of budget constraints or other reasons, many of the universities run outdated versions or not fully patched. And obviously, those systems can, again, be exploited. Okay, so let's dive more into the details here. I have to mention that this presentation includes only a small number of examples because of the time limitations, but there are many more examples and many more details that are included in the threat landscape report that we released, as Doug mentioned, this morning, just a few minutes ago, really. And so you're welcome to download the report and read the additional detail. So let's talk about a few emerging threats and prominent trends where it comes to the education industry. We're going to talk about third-party security risk, about the DDoS attacks they experience, ransomware attacks that impact education institutions the same way they impact many other businesses, and other types of malware. So let's start with the online education. Clearly, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, people couldn't go to the physical campuses, and universities and schools had to offer ways to connect online to trainings, to lessons or lectures, to content, to homework, to submit homeworks, etc. Systems had to be set up quickly, or interfaces, web interfaces had to be set up quickly so that students will be able to do that. And when things are done in a rush, clearly security is not that well taken care of. So we saw, as you can expect, cybercriminals targeting many of those online systems You can see some examples here. What you see here is a chart with the number of publicly accessible devices for each vertical. And while every vertical has some thousands, tens of thousands devices publicly accessible, when it comes to the education industry, there are almost 2 million servers and other devices that are publicly accessible. As I mentioned earlier, many of them are web servers like Apache, IIS, file transfer systems, but also many other types of systems like security cameras and logging systems, other systems. Again, the report provides many examples, including screenshots. Some of them are vulnerable. Some of them vulnerable even to vulnerabilities that are known to be publicly exploited based on the CISA catalog. Which means, I think it's quite obvious, if you have a server publicly accessible and it's vulnerable to a vulnerability that has exploits out there, the risk is huge. That can become one of the ways to infiltrate into that network. That server can become the backdoor into that network. There are a couple of mitigations that can help a lot. First of all, any system that doesn't need to be publicly accessible shouldn't be there, should be taken off the network, the internet. If it shall be accessible, it shall be placed behind the firewall. And the security policy shall limit access to that server to the minimum necessary, either by geography or by other type of configuration. If make sure that, especially servers that are publicly accessible, run the latest version and are fully patched. The passwords to those devices shall be strong, and definitely never use the default password to any of those devices. Okay? And last, make sure to maintain ongoing training, cybersecurity trainings, and awareness programs for staff and students that connect to those systems. Third-party risks is another type of vector that cyber attacks might happen through. Universities, like many other businesses, use software solutions from other vendors. They interact with web interfaces or some B2B services to get information on some services. They use hosting providers, storage providers, IT services. There are many examples for services that universities and schools rely on. Now, if the provider of any of those services is breached, then the attackers might get access also to their clients' networks, in particular those universities and schools. And you can see some examples here. If you take, for example, the MoveIt software, MoveIt is a software solution for transferring files, which obviously is very handy for universities that have to exchange information, receive files or provide files to their students or to organizations they work with. When MoveIt was breached, then many organizations, including universities, were breached. Here is an example from last summer. Based on our data, we found 13 major universities that were exploited through that MoveIt exploit. The breach was allowed through that MoveIt vulnerability exploitation. It's very hard to mitigate third-party threats because we can control our own networks. It's a lot harder to control the level of security in other vendors we work with, right? But nevertheless, you can require them to do security assessments regularly, provide you proofs that they meet the sufficient security levels. Clearly limit their access. If you work with service providers, limit their access to systems to the minimum necessary. Periodically conduct audits, penetration tests, monitor for activity around the systems they manage. If they are breached, what you shall expect is that the system they usually interact with or connect to or manage will exhibit abnormal behavior. For example, excessive data exfiltration. So by monitoring and using solutions that would monitor for abnormal behavior might detect those activities early. And ransomware attacks. Ransomware, of course, has become one of the most common malware attacks against the businesses and organizations out there. Unfortunately, they have become a really money machine to many threat groups out there. There are, if in the past they targeted mostly consumers, if you're long enough in the cybersecurity industry, remember them demanding $300 or $500 from consumers. But now they're going for much bigger targets. When they target a university, for example, that has a lot of data and they manage to exfiltrate that data, they can require a ransom fee, which will be much, much higher. The average ransom fee is now around $1 million, not specifically in the education industry, but in general. And it keeps increasing. And also the frequency of those attacks is increasing. So we understand that the bad guys are making more money, and this problem is not going to stop. And here you can see some examples of universities that were attacked that way. There are a couple of ransomware groups that are active. Over the years, some stop and some other new ones start. There are a few reasons for that, mostly around how those underground groups operate. But there are some groups that operate for a few years now. Lockbit is a good example. They keep releasing new versions, improved versions for their customers, which are cybercriminals as well. Rysida, Clop has been active, and there are a few other groups that have been active, in particular against universities and schools. What can we do to mitigate ransomware attacks? First of all, use host-based anti-malware tools that are capable of detecting, blocking, and quarantining ransomware malware. Make sure you use an effective email security controls, because quite often a ransomware attack will start with a phishing attack or a malicious email that has some malicious attachment or link included. Make sure you have a good incident response process and plan, because when this thing is going to hit, it's going to be messy. People will call you, your customers going to call you, regulators will ask for information, the press and the media are going to include negative coverage. You'd better have a good incident response process and train the people who have to act as part of it, so you're ready for that day. It's always good to ensure backups are available, but let's remember, backups are not sufficient anymore. The reason is many ransomware attacks now don't only limit access to the data or to servers, they also exfiltrate the data, and then they start the extortion, right? So they'll try to exfiltrate as much data as they can, and once they're done, they'll start posting messages that show that they managed to compromise that university or school network. They will provide some examples of internal information, internal diagrams, screenshots, etc., to them to prove that indeed they managed to infiltrate into that network, and they will try to start the extortion. In that case, backups are good to restore system, but they're not going to stop that extortion process, okay? So make sure you have good monitoring on all those databases that include that sensitive data. I know it's easy to say, hard to implement, again, because of that distributed, fragmented nature of universities. But if you manage to protect your databases and those servers that include the information, you might have more luck in blocking attempts to exfiltrate data from those devices. There are a couple of technologies that can help here, like network monitoring solutions or IDS devices. So let's look at a typical attack flow where it comes to education systems. And every attack flow will roughly follow these 5 steps, okay? First, the attacker has to get some initial foothold into the organization. Let's say we want to target some university in New York State. We need to have some initial foothold, okay? Then once we have reached it, and again, in the next slides, I'm going to discuss each step in greater level of detail. Once they get the initial foothold, they'll drop some payload. They'll run some scripts, drop some initial payload, some malware to reach persistence on that computer, and they'll start pivoting and expanding and moving laterally over those networks. Usually, the first computer that they manage to infect is not that interesting. It might be a computer of some staff member, but that's not where the data trove is. The data trove in some other database that exists somewhere. So they had to find a way to that database, which is not easy. For example, that staff member might not have permissions to move to other networks. So they have to figure out how to get there. We'll talk more about that. At some point, once they get to their target, they'll drop malware, for example, ransomware, and they'll start exfiltrate data. Or they might have other goals by infecting those systems. On the left side, you can see some of the threat actors that we see attacking universities and schools often. And on the right-hand side, you can see the tactics they use, either phishing, social engineering, exploitation of vulnerabilities in applications and databases, drive-by compromises by sending links to malicious websites, abuse of valid accounts, for example, by trying to brute force their passwords and running scripts, malicious scripts. So let's dive more into each step. Let's talk first about phishing. There are basically 2 ways how to conduct a successful phishing attack. Either you include a malicious link that the users click, and then they might be exposed, they will likely expose it to a phishing page that will ask for their credentials or credit card information or other malicious scripts. Or they will include a malicious attachment. What we see now, the most common file extension or file type that is used maliciously as attachments are HTML files. Might sound surprising to some of you because HTML might sound benign, but actually it's not. Those malicious HTML attachments are not benign at all. It's malicious code compiled and packaged and dropped when the user opens that HTML attachment. This is really just binary code packaged that way. But as you can see here, sometimes they use other types of malicious attachments like executables, spreadsheets, PDF files, Word documents, and others. There are different themes that they might use in the phishing attack, because phishing at the end will always use some sort of social engineering, because they need to convince the user to open the attachment or click the link. And on the here you can see the common themes they use where it comes to universities. Either emails that look like coming from universities asking for quotations that are sent to businesses, that are sent to other organizations asking for quotation, or other fake university communications. These are sent usually to students and staff members. It looks like in this example, it's coming from the university, asking the users their students to connect to some network because of some change. And of course, it's going to be just a phishing link. Sometimes we see phishing emails that offer jobs for students. Many of them are scams. Students naturally at some point look for jobs, and those offer scams can be very effective. Like we see in other industries, we see HR-themed spam and scams. The education industry actually is growing pretty rapidly, and so many people look for jobs, so those HR-themed scams might work well. And again, wire transfer scams, for example, business email compromised scams, also quite common. So then once the user opens that attachment or clicks a link, they need to move to the next step, which is getting access to the local computer. What we see they do most often is to run some PowerShell scripts or VBA macros. VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications, basically Microsoft technology for running scripts. So very often they'll use those scripts to install some malware locally or to configure some scheduled task on that local machine. Again, the threat report includes many examples, so I welcome you to download and take a look there. Then, as I mentioned, they'll start to pivot and move laterally over the network. And because they don't necessarily can access the remote machines, they have to figure out the credentials for the remote machines. As you can see at the top, the most common ways how they do that then is through brute force attacks. Right, that's the one at the top, that dark red portion of the diagram. Brute force attacks work great when the passwords are easy or when people use their default passwords. Then it shouldn't take too long to crack those passwords and find them. Organizations that enforce strong password policies will be much more immune to this kind of attack. If the password is long and combine different characters, it will be a lot harder. It will take much longer to crack that password. Okay. They also will start account manipulation, for example, looking for accounts that they can break into, again, through social engineering attacks that might work and might help them to get the necessary access. Eventually, they'll get to where they are looking for to those servers with the data, and they'll exfiltrate the data as much as they can. They'll try to exfiltrate as much data. So usually you see in those dark web posts, they stole hundreds of megabytes, terabytes, gigabytes, sometimes terabytes of data. As you can see here, there are a couple of ransomware groups that are active throughout the year. Some of them more active through certain seasons, and some of them are active almost across the year. But at the end, they use similar techniques. They use social engineering and they use exploitation. And to effectively protect your organizations, you'll have to cover those two attack vectors. The top 6 ransomware groups claim more than 40% of all the breaches we've seen in the education sector in 2023. Okay. Once they are ready, they exfiltrate enough data or gained access and manage to establish access into some internal network system, they will try to sell it. If they store data, usually what they'll do is to try extortion against that organization. As I said, the average ransom fee now is around $1 million. So once the organizations pay, that can really help them make money. But there are other ways how they make money. For example, trying to sell access to networks they manage to compromise. Okay, you see 2 examples here, and again, the threat reports include more examples. Those 2 examples are from universities in the States, but it's really not limited to the States. We see attacks against the universities and schools around the world. I started by mentioning those universities in the UK. Okay. So peer recommendations and mitigations. There are a couple of things in general, areas you should focus on to minimize risk. And it's a very hard problem. I'm not taking lightly at all the challenge of protecting a large university or some school chain. First, focus on the human element. As you saw quite often, they will get foothold through social engineering attacks. The more people, students and staff members are trained to understand how those phishing emails look like, the smaller the chances that they will click those links or attachments in malicious emails. Similarly, they should be trained about keeping good hygiene with their laptops and devices. For example, have an effective antivirus, an up-to-date antivirus on their laptops. Refrain from dubious websites. I remember one security guy from a university in the States, he told me that their worst time is when all the students come back from their summer vacation because they have so much time at home and they browsed all kinds of websites, their laptops got infected, and now they come and connect to the networks. And they see a big spike then in the number of infected machines that connect to the network. So the more you educate those students and staff members about those risks, the smaller the risk is going to be for your network. Second thing, as we showed, many of the scams and the malicious, many of the scams and the attacks are carried out through email. Malicious emails that contain links or attachments that are will cause harm. If you use an effective email security solution, you will be able to block many of them. And in fact, if you run two of them side by side, the chances that a malicious email will get through both of them will be much smaller. Just as an example, we installed Microsoft 365 and next to it, the Trustwave email security gateway. And some malicious email, Microsoft 365 was pretty effective in blocking many of the emails, but malicious emails, but some still went through. Of those that went through, our email security solution was able to detect 90% of those. So you end up with much smaller risk to your organization if you use a layered email protection approach. Vulnerability management, you gotta understand your inventory of devices and make sure they are properly patched, especially those that are publicly accessible, but not limited to. Remember, once they get a foothold to your internal network, they'll try to exploit also internal systems. So there are vulnerability management solutions, patching solutions to make sure that systems get properly and quickly patched and run supported versions. So inventory, already mentioned that. We talked about suppliers, the risk of third-party compromises. And we talked in one of the earlier slides about what you can do when you work with those vendors to minimize risk. It's, as I said, one of the most challenging parts, but make sure you work with vendors that can convince you they have good security in place. Okay, we talked about the response process. You might have a breach, and it's quite likely you're going to have a breach at some point. What are you going to do then? Who's going to respond to that? How quickly are you going to find it? How quickly are you going to be able to remediate it? How are you going to communicate to the board, to upper management, to the media, to your customers, to your students and staff members? If you are prepared, if you have a good communication and engineering plan, then you'll be able to use it when that bad day comes. If no such process and plan is prepared, it's going to be very messy, and it's going to take much longer to remediate that incident, and with a much harder reputation damage. And last, as we all know, it's not a matter of whether we're going to breach, but only a matter of when. Perhaps some threat actors already lurking in your networks. If you conduct active threat monitoring and hunting, you might be able to discover them quickly before the big damage happens. If you conduct them regularly, let's say once a month, let professionals search your network for any sign of a breach. And if they find that, remediated and harden those environments properly, the risk is going to be smaller. Perhaps I give just some examples during this presentation about our threat intelligence, but the threat report provides many more examples. We collect enormous amount of threat intelligence for our customers. Billions of events every day are collected into our systems. We deliver hundreds of thousands of pen test hours every year. We discover tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in the environment we scan. We find, on average, up to 10,000 phishing runs that no other vendor detects every day. And there are many other examples for the excellent threat intelligence that helps us with research like you see here. In the spiderLabs team, which is this expert team within spiderLabs, within Trustwave, there are over 250 experts. Researchers, penetration testers, incident responders, threat hunters, and other experts. As you can see here, we have a very active blog site which get covered by the media very often, more than once a day on average. We released about 70 blogs with great technical content every year, welcoming you to take a look at the spiderLabs blog and follow us. So with that, I think, Doug, we have some time for questions.
We certainly do. Thanks for all the information there. Just a reminder, if you haven't placed a question in there and you have one, please do so. They are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about me calling you out on anything. But here are the first couple. Let's get going. First, since many educational institutions at all levels sometimes have limited funding and resources dedicated to cybersecurity, what do you recommend when it comes to prioritizing or maximizing those limited resources?
That's an excellent question. And actually, I want to highlight the first part first, which is one of the challenges of universities that are funded by sometimes taxpayer money, and their budget is limited, even if they're not as resourceful like global companies, right? So that limits their ability to, for example, purchase expensive solutions, etc. That said, there are things that can be done. For example, trainings to their staff members and to their students shouldn't cost much, but they can be effective. They will reduce the cost. Monitoring solutions can be set up and shouldn't be very expensive. Some of them actually, even there are open source tools that can be used. The highest risk, as we saw, are with those publicly accessible servers. So it shouldn't be too difficult to find what those servers are, or use services of experts to find them and eliminate as many of them, or at least properly protect them. And even email security solutions are not terribly expensive, and they can, especially if they're used in 2 layers, can help reduce the risk. Reducing the risk, cybersecurity risk, costs money. I mean, it's a mandatory expense for any organizations now around the world. We understand that the cost of reputation damage and the cost of disruption can be hard. So it's a mandatory expense. How to exactly balance it and how much to spend on cybersecurity protection, it's up to every organization, but there are certainly things that can be done here.
Excellent. This one, it's kind of a bit of a follow-up on the first one, honestly. It goes, how can we advocate for increased cybersecurity awareness and investment within our educational facility, university, primary school, whichever?
Sure. The first goal, in my opinion, shall be increasing awareness among the board and upper management. For example, as years pass, we see more and more examples of universities that their business was disrupted, their networks were disrupted during cyber attacks, and they got better coverage out there in the media. Universities that are run as businesses want to have good reputation. They don't want to have any disruption. They want students to feel safe when they connect to their networks. It's bad for their business. This kind of media coverage is bad for their business, and disruption can also disrupt their revenues. So it's the first thing I'd say, increase awareness among upper management and the board, because then you'll get the support to hire IT security people for funding that will allow the IT security teams to buy different security solutions, run trainings, etc. So I would actually start with that. Then, of course, make sure you have a good security plan. You know, we went over the different pieces here. For example, how to control, how to minimize risk of a breach, how to find it quickly. And in some cases, yes, consider getting help from expert teams, external expert teams like threat hunting, because it can discover those breaches faster and minimize the hit on the organization.
All right, our next question. You mentioned the problem of infected student laptops coming back after breaks, but how should I think about managing the increasing number of devices accessing our networks, like BYOD, personal devices, things that we don't really want on the network, but are?
Yeah, that's perhaps one of the hardest parts here, which is, again, unique to the education sector, right? I think there's a limit how much policy you can enforce here. For example, corporate laptops, you can require to run antiviruses, right? And other security policies. It's not possible to do the same with student laptops. I'd say at the least, try to identify those areas in your networks that students access and have good monitoring between those networks and other networks where your critical servers are. For example, students might need to connect to a lab, to some lab, but they don't necessarily need to access the systems where all the, for example, intellectual property of that university exists, right? So between identified areas on your networks that are dirtier than others, and put strong monitoring between those segments, network segments, and other parts of the network. At the end, you want to make sure that all those servers and systems that are critical for your business, that hold the most sensitive information, are properly protected and are inaccessible by poorly maintained devices like student laptops.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered about all we have time for right now. So we're going to wrap this up. Any other questions that do come in, as I said earlier, will be answered via email. So to finish out here, I want to thank Ziv for his presentation, and especially to thank all of you for taking the time to attend this event. We hope to see you back here again very soon. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much.